The auto render mode, the interactive auto render mode in Blazor. It still confuses lots of people, so let me clarify, hopefully once and for all, how this works. As you can see on my screen, I want to create a Blazor web app, and this is already Visual Studio 2026. It's called Insiders for whatever reason. And this is the preview edition, right? And as you can also see, I got the preview of .NET 10. To be more precise, this is release candidate 1. So let's see if something's changed. But I don't think it will be that bad actually in .NET 10, right? So the most important thing, what you want here is interactive render mode. Set this to auto. It already tells you server and WebAssembly. Now, depending on how much experience you already have with Blazor and then you enter new render modes since .NET 8, meaning Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly as render mode, not the older architecture where you would have to choose upfront, I want to use a Blazor Server app, I want to use a Blazor WebAssembly app, and I can't change it. Now you can change it afterwards, but with auto you get both worlds right at the beginning, and you can still decide then to change. But let's configure this and create the new project. Then I like to choose per page per component. So for every component, I can decide myself what render mode do I want to use here. With global, well, it would be global for the complete application. And that's pretty much it. So let's create this project real quick. And then I just want to show you in only a couple of minutes how this actually works, what is actually going on there. And the very first thing you want to look at is your program CS.
By the way, if any of my videos have ever helped you, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. It really helps me keep making these tutorials, which in turn might help you becoming a better .NET developer. So please hit subscribe. It is free. Thank you so much. And if you want to get the source code of this tutorial together with a comprehensive written tutorial, I've got a new Substack newsletter. Link, as always, in the video description below.
There you can see, if you're not sure, I don't know, you have a project, a Blazor project, and you're not sure what render mode is configured there up front, then you can see here that with add Razor components and then add interactive server components, this is what you need for the Blazor server interactive render mode. And down here then also add interactive server render app mode. I have no idea why all these errors are here. Well, it's a preview edition of Visual Studio in .NET 10, so let's see if this still runs. And the other thing then is WebAssembly, right? So if you want to use WebAssembly, we need this line here. Tooltips help sometimes, add services to support rendering interactive WebAssembly components, and then also this thingy here, add interactive WebAssembly render mode, but additionally add additional assemblies, adds the given additional assemblies to the component application. And what you see here is this argument is necessary to make a WebAssembly work. It says the provided assemblies will be scanned for pages that will be mapped as endpoints. In essence, what Microsoft did here was we always have this imports Razor page, as you can see here in the Solution Explorer, right? And they just grab this, and from that file, the assembly. In older examples, you would see something like the counter page there, because this is a default example page that they provide in this template here. But with that, you see that everything is configured, all right? We got Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. Now, let me just try to run this, and I hope the error is gone then. Yeah, it says build succeeded. This is nice. So Visual Studio is telling me something that is not true. Okay, it says there is an error. Seems to be missing, but it actually is not. Anyways, now the other thing that tells you that the auto render mode or everything that you need for the auto render mode is already there is this client project. So again, maybe you already know this, but for people who, I don't know, started out with Blazor and want to know, okay, I got the idea of the server render mode and I got the idea of the WebAssembly render mode. Now what's going on with auto? Because auto still, it's, I think, the most confusing render mode for most Blazor developers. So it maybe needs some more clarification. The client project is necessary for Blazor WebAssembly in essence. But here's the catch: with auto, you want both worlds, right? You want to use Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. So you need everything that you also need for WebAssembly and server in that case. So the client project tells you here we have Blazor WebAssembly configured. We have the program CS here as well, but everything in this project is much smaller, right? In essence, here in the server project, we have all the .NET web API capabilities as well. We can see this here in the dependencies. When we go to frameworks, you see Microsoft .NET Core App and ASP.NET Core App, Microsoft ASP.NET Core App. When you go down here and look at frameworks, then you only see Microsoft .NET Core App. So this thing here on top, this tells you, in essence, we can also build a web API out of that, right? Or implement it here. We can add controllers. Then you would also have to add something in the program CS. And all that is the starting project and running on the server. All right. So this is the very important thing. All that is running on the server. So when you have Blazor Server used as interactive render mode, this is what's going on. Regarding WebAssembly, you need this part down here. Now, what is Auto doing? Well, it's using both, but not at the same time. It is using it one after another. It starts with Blazor Server, and I will show you what this means in a sec, and then it continues with Blazor WebAssembly. All right. Now, for the example here, you see this is how you define the render mode, right? So here they are already using interactive auto. And now comes the fun part. What about pre-rendering? I will show you that in the browser. So let's go back to Chrome again. And when I now open the console, and let me clear all the site data. Again, back to the console. And now let me go to the counter page. You see the following. Let me do this one more time to be really sure that everything is cleared in the cache. We empty the cache and hard reload. And now what you see here is WebSocket connected, right? So this is exactly the same that you would see also with Blazor Server, right? The server render mode. Not to confuse with static server-side rendering. Static server-side rendering has nothing to do with the render modes. This is perfect for landing pages that don't need any kind of interactivity. For instance, a real button. I say real button because you could also use just the A tag in HTML and design it, style it like a button, but this would not be a real button. And if you want a button that is doing something like this counter button here, then you would need Blazor Server interactivity. And now what happens when I reload this page? Complete reload, right? So here now, you see there's nothing going on with any kind of WebSocket connection, right? Now this means now we're using Blazor WebAssembly, all right? So everything, all the assembly, the DLLs in essence, are downloaded to the client. And this is what the auto render mode does. When you're running your page the first time, or the user accesses your page with the Blazor Server interactive render mode, then in the background, all the stuff that's necessary for Blazor WebAssembly to work is downloaded. The big advantage of that is that the performance and the first encounter of the user and your page is faster. So the usability is better in essence, right? The user experience is better. And then when the user comes back, it is not happening on the fly. When the user comes back, then he or she already has all the DLLs, all the files that are necessary for WebAssembly to work, and then everything is happening on the client. All right. So this is the auto render mode in a nutshell. But of course, you have to pay attention when you want to use it in a real world application. Because let's go back to Visual Studio. With that, we have a couple of scenarios that we have to consider here. The first thing is pre-rendering, right? Now, pre-rendering, and there's a big change regarding pre-rendering in .NET 10. Check out my other videos about that. With pre-rendering, your code is always running first on the server. It doesn't matter if you use the server render mode, the WebAssembly render mode, or the auto render mode in one of these states. Everything is pre-rendered on the server, like using static server-side rendering. And then from pre-rendering, the next step is the so-called hydration. So this is the part where the interactivity kicks in. And this means that when you loaded some data, for instance, as you can see here in the weather page, when you want to load some data, and Visual Studio is having a good time, it seems, then first the data is fetched on the server, all right? Even when you use Blazor WebAssembly or Auto in WebAssembly state, then it's first fetched on the server and then again on the client, all right? And this is even true for Blazor server. I know this is totally confusing, but I want to focus on the auto render mode. With that, of course, you have to know how the other render modes work as well, because you use both. But if you have problems with the auto render mode, most of the time, this is the cause, that you got pre-rendering enabled. Although you think, hey, actually this should now run with WebAssembly, it is still doing something on the server. So let's say here now we move the weather page to the client. Okay. Let me just remove this thing here. Okay. And now we say here also, I want to use render mode interactive auto, like that. And let me close this here real quick. Okay. All right, now interactive auto it is on the weather page. Now let's just restart the application. All right, there we are. And let me just reload this one more time. Some errors here. Okay. We go to the weather page and you see that we actually get the data here, right? Now let me again clear the site data and then run this thing again. First time, I was hoping to see a WebSocket connection. Let's try this one more time. Clear site data, please. Go to the console. Empty cache, hard reload. Okay, maybe this is Visual Studio. I don't know, but it seemed it was still getting data from the cache. So this is what I wanted to show you. Again, we see we have a WebSocket connection here on the weather page. And when I now reload, we shouldn't see it. Okay, this is nice. So now WebAssembly is there. But what you could also see is that we have this strange flash, right? So you reload the page. Now it doesn't really matter what render mode it is, but you see the change. I reload, I first have 11 here, which is quite fast actually, and then loading, and then 29. Why the hell is that? Well, this has nothing to do with auto or server or WebAssembly. This is pre-rendering, right? So what we could do is actually either just disable pre-rendering. So here now I would say new interactive auto render mode and then false, because this is now pre-rendering, this parameter here, all right? Here you see it, bool pre-render is then set to false. By default, it is true. Okay, it reloaded now. Let me do this one more time. You see WebSocket connection is used. Let's do this one more time. And now it's using WebAssembly one more time again. But you see that we have a certain loading, not animation, but we see the loading text. We don't have this flash, right? That we see one specific data point, or we see the temperature and then it is changing again. Still, I have to say, this is something that many devs, me included, did before .NET 10, that we just disabled pre-rendering because it was really annoying. But you see that the usability could actually be amazing if we use pre-rendering, because the data was there pretty fast, right? So when we go back now to Visual Studio and now use pre-rendering again, there's one thing that we could do, and this is using the persistent state attribute. Again, actually has nothing to do with the auto render mode, but you can still use it with the auto render mode. And this is why I want to show you that. And what we have to do here now is we have to turn this into a property, right? So just rename this thing and add a getter and a setter. Maybe make this public as well. All right, like that. And then also very important, we have to check if we already have the data. Yeah. So if the forecast is actually, or forecasts, if this is null, then we want to generate forecasts. If not, please create new ones. All right, again, it is reloading. And this is now what's happening. Maybe you saw it already. It changed the data here. We're using WebSockets. So this is Blazor server in action, including pre-rendering. And when we now reload, we already see the 49, but we're using Blazor WebAssembly. And again, the crazy part now is that with the persistence data attribute and all the render modes combined, we generate the data on the server already during pre-rendering, and then the data, or the so-called state, is then moved on, it's given, it is, you know what I mean, to the hydration part, meaning to the interactivity part. And this works for both the server part and the WebAssembly part. And this means that it also works with auto. All right. Still, one more thing I want to tell you, because otherwise the tutorial would be too long if I would implement this. Since you use the auto render mode and you say, okay, this is fine, Patrick, it is generating some mock data. What if I want to access data from a database with Entity Framework, for instance? This is the most tricky, the trickiest part, the hardest part. If you want to fetch data from the server and the database, you now know that this is the server part, right? So we could add a controller here with an endpoint or a minimal API endpoint, whatever you like, and then grab the data from a database, whatever you want to do here, or just generate the data on the server only, right? Now, how would you get the data to the client? Well, you would need an API call, right? So you can do the following. You can implement your API call here, and then you get the data from the server, but this would actually only work for Blazor WebAssembly, because when you are on WebAssembly mode, let's say, then we're doing our thing from the client. But with auto render mode, you also first start with the server, right? So this means you kinda have to implement a feature twice, but it's not really a duplication, because what you could do is you could also add the HTTP client here on your server project. Listen to me carefully. You can add the HTTP client and register it on your server project, make a call to yourself. I know this sounds strange and it maybe is not the best performance because it's really not that bad. This is one solution you could do. So you implement your API call here as well. And this means in both situations, because you want to use the auto render mode, in both situations, you can use your API call once on the server and then the other time on the client. And now with pre-rendering, you kind of would have to do this anyways, right? Because pre-rendering happens on the server. So this means when you use your auto render mode, and I hope you wrote this down, when you're using the auto render mode, and now also Blazor WebAssembly kicks in with pre-rendering, then you grab the data on the server first. So you need the server implementation anyways, if you use WebAssembly with pre-rendering or the auto render mode anyways, okay? I hope you're still with me. So this is one way. The other way to implement that would be, and let me do this with you just a little, you could create a new project. So let's say add new project. And what you want to do here is you want to add a class library project. So a class library project, right? And we could call this, let's just call this shared, all right? Also .NET 10. And what you then can do here is you create your interface in this shared class library. So let's say we have a weather forecast service implementation. You want to use dependency injection there, meaning you have your interface defined. This interface lands in here and you have references to the shared project in your client project and your server project, all right? And this then means that you would implement the interface here on the client once. The service implementation in that case would make the API call, And then on the server, you wouldn't do an API call anymore, but you have another service implementation where you directly access Entity Framework, for instance, or your repository or whatever it is. I hope this makes sense. All right, so now you still don't have a duplicate implementation, but yes, it is true that you kind of you have to think in two modes, right? And you always have to do this if you want to use the auto render mode. Doesn't matter if you use pre-rendering or not with the auto render mode, because it will start with Blazor server anyways, then go to Blazor WebAssembly. But if you want to use pre-rendering, and I think it does make sense with .NET 10 now, then you would also have to do this. Doesn't matter if you use Blazor WebAssembly, right, or Blazor server. Your implementation starts on the server, and of course with WebAssembly then you also have the client implementation that is necessary. Now, this was a lot of mumbling. I hope you got the idea. Please tell me your questions in the comments below, because I really want to make this better, explain this in a better way so you really understand it, because this is the most confusing part for every developer who touches Blazor and is then confused why some things are not working. And I think in 95% of the times, it has something to do with the render modes and pre-rendering, and you don't know what mode is currently active, although it's actually not that hard if you got behind it once. It can still be a little bit confusing, of course, sometimes if you forget something, but in essence, this is where you have to pay attention. What render mode is active? Is pre-rendering active? And then where do I have to make my implementations? Okay, I hope this helped a little bit. Please tell me in the comments. Again, tell me your questions. I will try to show you more examples, and maybe it's also good to get this in written form. So please check out the link below in the video description for my new Substack newsletter. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I see you next time. Take care.